Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Wolf Conservation Center and Western Watersheds Project for tonight's webinar. We're going to give it a few more minutes just to let folks join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you for your patience. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and happy Lobo Week. My name is Regan Downey, and I'm the Director of Education at the Wolf Conservation Center, and I'll be moderating tonight's program. For those who might be unfamiliar with the Wolf Conservation Center, we work to advance the survival of wolves by inspiring a global community through education, advocacy, research, and recovery, and we're funded entirely by people like you, so thank you. Our scientific webinar series allows us to bridge the gap between research and the general public, which allows for engaging discussions and increased advocacy. We're so excited to welcome Greta Anderson, the Deputy Director at Western Watersheds Project. Greta has worked with Western Watersheds Project since 2007, and she has degrees in geography and ethnobotany, a background in traditional herbalism, and has a deep interest in issues of social and environmental justice. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping tips. You can use two Zoom features to communicate with us. You can use the chat feature for general commentary and the question and answer box for questions. We'll have a designated question and answer session at the end of the webinar. If you want a question to be answered during the program, you need to type it into the Q&A box. We won't be monitoring the chat for questions. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available for viewing on the Wolf Center's YouTube channel within the next week. But with that, I will turn things over to Greta. Take it away, Greta.
Thank you, Regan. Thanks, everybody, and thank you to the Wolf Conservation Center for hosting me tonight. I'm looking forward to sharing this presentation with you. I should start out by caveating that I've never actually seen any of the CSI shows, but it sounded exciting. So CSI, Mexican Wolf Experimental Population Area, is what you're here for, and I'll try to live up to the hype. And so tonight's presentation, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got started in this work, what we uncovered, and what has happened as a result of that. So bear with me as we get going. As Regan mentioned, I work for Western Watersheds Project. I live in Tucson, Arizona, on the lands of the Tohono O'odham people. Western Watersheds Project is a nonprofit conservation organization that works throughout the West to limit the ecological harms of public lands livestock grazing. And a little bit of information about that for folks who maybe are less familiar, but out West, we have quite a large percentage of lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service, a few other agencies, but the majority of those, about 220 million acres of the West, is managed by federal land management agencies for livestock grazing. So it's private livestock operators who have permits to graze a certain amount of livestock on their on a allotment. They're called allotments. And so each of these these allotments you can see in brown here take up a lot of space, and that is some of the best remaining habitat for wildlife in this country. It's a huge mass of land, and livestock grazing is the most ubiquitous use of those public lands. The reason that we focus on the effects of public lands livestock grazing is that there's a lot of real downsides to this land use, including water pollution. Livestock can affect water quality and quantity, spread E. coli and diseases, and they spread invasive species like plants that change fire regimes. They carry the seeds on their coats, and when they ingest them and then deposit them in new areas. And they also damage the soil crusts that are really important for preventing invasive species from getting established. They compete with and displace native wildlife. And for every cow or calf or I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix my screen here. There we go. For all of the domestic livestock that you see on public lands, you can just imagine that that food would otherwise be going to deer, rabbits, other ungulates, native wildlife species that in fact are the prey base for native predators. But on average, we give about 50% of the annual production of vegetation to livestock operators on public land. And there's government's estimates that every cow-calf pair that you see on public lands, this is the equivalent animal unit month. The forage consumed is the equivalent of 2 elk, 7 deer, or 11 pronghorn. So it's quite an impact on the prey base. Livestock also have other impacts on public lands, like the destruction of cultural resources. They trample potsherds, knock over adobe walls. The whole program runs at an economic deficit for the taxpayer. Ranchers pay $1.35 per cow-calf pair per month to graze on our public lands. And the program runs at a loss of up to $500 million a year, just managing the program and mitigating the impacts. So $1.35 a month to feed your 1,000-pound cow and her calf. It's a pretty good deal. Also, for those of you who recreate on public lands, you won't be surprised to learn that livestock create conflicts for recreational users in addition to damaging and degrading the waterways. They also, the fencing and the infrastructure also create impacts to your recreational experience. And cows themselves on public lands, cows, bulls, are dangerous. And every year hikers get trampled by livestock running loose. And then one of the biggest emerging threats of public lands livestock grazing that we're just learning more and more about is how the removal of forage and vegetation lowers the carbon sequestration potential of those public lands. So by having livestock on the public lands, it reduces their ability to help us fight climate change. And here's a few choice photographs taken by my colleagues at Western Watersheds Project, where you can see some damage on public lands, grazing allotments. But what we're here to talk about tonight is that public lands livestock grazing is responsible for the extermination of predators throughout the Western United States. And back in the day, the United States government actually financed an eradication campaign for wolves. They were quite successful at it. And this was at the behest of the livestock industry that was trying to make the range safe for cattle. This is, pre-Endangered Species Act. The two pictures I've got showing here are two wolves named Lobo and Blanca. Blanca's on the lower right. And these are images taken by Ernest Thomas Seton in 1894, and he was one of these wolf trappers who was sent out to take care of all of the wolves and make the range safe for cattle. Well, we know that the sort of condensed version of that story is, as humans learned more about the importance of predators and native predators in an ecosystem, and the Endangered Species Act was passed, we started bringing species like Mexican gray wolves back. And here is a cute picture of a Mexican gray wolf in the wild in 2018 on a trail camera. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, because that's primarily what I work on here in the Tucson office. So here is a wolf being released. This image was from 2019, but Mexican gray wolves were restored to the landscape of the Southwest starting in 1998. And they were released after being bred out in a captive breeding program. There's a long, rich history of Mexican wolf recovery that I won't bore you with tonight or retell tonight, because plenty of people have already told it. But just suffice it to say that wolves, through hard work and persistence, are making a comeback and from this reintroduction effort. And here is where Mexican gray wolves are in the Southwest. Here is the US-Mexico borderline. Here is the Arizona and New Mexico border. And all of the blobby areas are the currently occupied habitats of Mexican wolves. Or what are considered occupied habitats based on recent use on the landscape. And you can see where these overlap with the green. Those are all national forest and public lands. You can't really make it out very well, but in the background here, a lot of these are state trust lands or Bureau of Land Management lands. So a lot of the landscape that Mexican gray wolves are on today are public lands. As I was explaining earlier, private ranchers get to use them at a very low cost. So since the reintroduction began in 1998, the population of wolves has increased. You can see the numbers, and the blue line is the population line. And this past year, the number isn't up here yet, but in 2023, it was 257. So we've been seeing a steady growth. But what had started to concern me, and one of the main threats to wolves, lobos in the Southwest and wolves everywhere, is the animosity of the livestock industry to their reintroduction. And what has happened with the Mexican wolf program is whenever there were a certain number of depredations, here previous to 2009, there was a 3 strikes rule. If a wolf was responsible for 3 livestock killings, it was removed from the wild. After that, they gave the agencies a little more discretion, but we started to see an uptick in removals again between 2018 and 2020. And there were 15 wolves removed during that period, both lethally and non-lethally, which means they take them out and put them permanently in captivity, which to a wild wolf is kind of probably a death sentence in and of itself. And we started to see this conflict. This is a period of conflict. And we were trying to understand, well, what can be done? We were also seeing that the reports of livestock wolf conflict were going up. And this graph represents the number of depredations per 100 wolves. And if you see in 2018, 2019, the number of depredations was going up really high. So they were basically the attribution of livestock deaths to Mexican wolves was almost doubling. And this is an independent variable of the number of wolves on the landscape, because this is per 100 wolves. So keep that in mind, because what I started doing and what I was interested in is thinking, well, how can we reduce this conflict? And I work on public lands, livestock grazing. So I was interested to know, where are these conflicts occurring and what can be done differently in the grazing to help reduce this. I, under the Freedom of Information Act request, started requesting depredation investigations. And this is small here. The details aren't super important, but key factors is just to show you, this is kind of a typical investigation report. And Up here, where you see all the black, those are, and over here, those are redactions. And those redactions come through to protect the individual cattle owners or livestock operators' information. So even though these depredation investigations and the depredation incidents are taking place on public lands, they wouldn't tell us where it was happening because those dead livestock are considered financial private data of the ranchers. So it was very frustrating because how can you make suggestions for improved livestock management if you don't know where these things are happening? Well, one lucky day, my colleague Cindy Toole and she really deserves a lot of credit for this research as well. She did a lot of tracking in the early days with the FOIAs. We received a spreadsheet that I just had to print out because all those black boxes are the redactions and all of the information about the permittee names and the numbers of cows or the investigation details. But this particular spreadsheet had one very critical thing, which was location data, which is what we wanted. And it had the location data of the depredation incidents linked to the dates. And if you go back, we had the dates for the depredation investigations. And all of a sudden, we were able to put these two things together. It was a lot of work. And my colleague, Melissa Kane, formerly with Western Watersheds Project, came up with this map. These were just the confirmed wolf depredations. So this is a map of the green is the grazing allotments, the National Forest lands grazing allotments within primarily where Mexican wolves are now. The red are confirmed instances of Mexican wolf depredation on livestock. And this was all the way from the beginning of the program, 1998 through 2020. So this was the first time we were able to see kind of the spatial expanse of where these depredations were happening, because we put this together with our data about grazing allotments. And so we were able to start seeing places like this where, wow, there's a lot of depredations happening on that allotment, or over here, there's a little cluster over here. And that gave us some sense of where we could start working and advocating for change. And that spreadsheet that we got that I showed you with all the redactions, it had just enough information that we were able to start analyzing it. And we found some pretty interesting things. So for all of the investigations that were done, the depredation investigations, 93% of them were blamed on Mexican gray wolves between 1998 and 2020. Now, this is Mexican gray wolves by far outweighed coyote, feral dog, black bear, mountain lions, all of those much more numerous predators on the same landscapes. Where wolves were considered to be the predator of a dead or injured livestock, 90% of the time they confirmed it. It wasn't a possible or probable, it was a confirmed. This is saying, yes, we know Mexican wolves were to blame. And this is important because confirmed kills are eligible for higher payments under compensation programs, and probable and possible get lesser payment. And that I'm not even going into the payment aspect of all of this, but there's a lot of money at stake with these investigations. So you came for cute pictures, probably. And so there's my little mental break, because we're about to start looking at some of these depredation investigations, which is no fun. Once Cindy and I started looking at the depredation reports, we started having a lot of questions because, for example, here is an investigation from 2014 where the only evidence left on site were some bone chips and some wolf scat. And this was considered a probable wolf kill. There were coyote tracks present, but not wolf tracks. There was wolf scat, but not coyote scat. And they knew there were wolves in the area, so they deemed this a probable wolf kill. Pretty good from those. If this were really CSI, I'm not sure those two bone chips would have passed the test, right? Here's another one. This was from Catron County in 2019, where all they found was a piece of hide. They said that the cow had been dead estimated about 3 months dead when they found it. They took the piece of hide and soaked it in a barrel of water for a few weeks till they spread it out, stretched it out, and measured the supposed bite marks that matched the canine spread of Lobos. And there had been wolves in the area, and the report said this. It wasn't clear whether the wolves were there when it was investigated or 3 months prior. But anyway, this particular hide was confirmed as having been killed by a wolf. Another one, this one, let's see. This one was another one where they soaked the hide in order to look for canine spreads. And it's important to note that the canine spreads of wolves overlap with feral dogs and coyotes. So there's a range, depending on whether it's juvenile or male or female. And some of those numbers overlap. So that in and of itself is not conclusive that a wolf was involved. And here where you've got, you have to stretch out the skin, like at what point, how do you know when to stop stretching it to get an accurate measurement? But indeed, this one was also confirmed. This one was interesting. The cow had been dead about 2 weeks. There's not much left of it. They found no bite marks on the carcass. There was some blood on the rib cage, but there were wolf tracks and scat in the area. And so this was blamed on a specific pack of wolves. So again, there's evidence that wolves were there. Wolves will eat and scavenge on dead livestock, but this was confirmed as a wolf kill without any further evidence. And there were some really ridiculous ones. This was one like where the Catron County 2019, the apparent point of first feeding was from the rear end to the head, which was a little bit of a mystery because all they had left were the back legs. Another one, I couldn't get the date for this presentation, but this is one of the examples. Here's one where there's only head and neck of a calf left to investigate, but they were able to determine that the wolves had started eating it from the front to the rear. So, there were all kinds of examples of these inconsistencies, and we started really having some questions. And another palate cleanser, cute wolf pups. This one would be much more of a palate cleanser if these wolves had not later been wiped out by a combination of lethal removals and disappearance after this pack was blamed for approximately 40 depredations in a period of just a couple of years. So as we're reading this stuff, we're not, wildlife forensic experts or anything. But we started writing about it. I started asking questions. I was writing a blog called The Wildlife News on the Wildlife News, where I was putting up these reports. Other people, wildlife services, retired investigators were like, yeah, no way, that's not a wolf kill. And then we started doing some media work around it, asking questions like, why can't we get the answers to these questions? And you'll see this top story was actually the first investigative story we got in a major paper, and that was the Arizona Daily Star in August 2020. But as we kept foiing, we found out we weren't the only ones with questions. And we uncovered an email from the Robert Gosnell, who is the state director of wildlife services at the time. They're the agency that goes out and does the investigations. And he emailed a colleague to say, oh, we're under investigation. There's some allegations that our investigators have been or are showing favoritism to ranchers. So this was pretty interesting to me when we started to see things like this, because we had questions about how these things are being approved, and even within the agency, there were apparently some questions. Fast forward, in 2021, I started working with an investigative reporter named Spencer Roberts, who, I was saying all this, that, I was showing him the information. He had his own questions. He started doing his own interviews and investigations. And in this article that came out in May of 2022, he was able to he landed an interview with the state director, who had since moved on from New Mexico. But in the interview, he said, I know some of those depredation reports that caused removals were illegal. My guys in the field were going and rubber stamping anything these people asked them to. Top guy in the state working for the agency admitting in this report that in fact these investigations were not always on the up and up. So we've, done, oh no, there we go. We've done a lot of work to expose this, and eventually, starting right about the same time as that Intercept article, and you should go Google it if you haven't read it, and Regan can send out the links later. But as a result, in August of 2023, so just last year, the Wildlife Services announced that it's using new standards of evidence. So they're no longer just using wolf scat and a couple of bone fragments to blame it on a wolf. They are using standards that are consistent with what the agency does in other states, Montana, Wisconsin, Oregon, and Idaho, where they also have wolves. They're using scientific standards and evidence to verify a wolf involvement. The main thing is that it depends upon the presence of subcutaneous hemorrhage and underlying tissue damage. So it can't just be that the wolf bit the cow, because that could have happened after. It could have been a non-lethal bite, or it could have happened during a scavenging event after the cow was already dead. Now, what they have to have is evidence that the cow was alive when the wolf bit it. And the way that that shows up is tissue damage and muscles that bleed. And so that should be evidence in the depredation investigations. And then the new standards also recognize that sometimes small livestock like calves get quickly consumed and there won't be signs of hemorrhaging, but it has other factors to consider. And as a result of the application of these new standards, we have seen the mean number of depredations per 100 wolves go down. So remember earlier I showed you where it spiked. It's gone back down to about half of the level that it was in the worst years. But best of all is that the absence of confirmed depredation events has meant that there have been fewer and no removals of Mexican wolves for livestock depredation in the past few years. There was one depredation event, one lethal removal in 2023. It was a Mexican wolf named Rusty. His number was 1296, and we did not support his removal. We oppose all lethal removals for livestock predation on public land, but the number has gone down. There were no lethal or permanent removals in 2021 or 2022. So that's the thing that we're most trying to prevent is using faulty reporting to falsely blame wolves, and then they end up either dead or in doggy jail the rest of their lives. So the status of this, the new investigation standards were adopted in August of 2023. Ranchers are working quite hard to try to pull them back. They think it's not fair, it's too hard. They would have to get out and find their dead animal right away. And we're saying, well, if we're going to be removing endangered species, we want to be sure that everything leading up to that is true and accurate. So we're still kind of fighting over this, but ultimately it's been a success. And for more information about this or Mexican wolves in general, you can go to Lobos of the Southwest. The Wolf Conservation Center does a great job with wolf education, and that's my website and my email. And just want to say that it's not every day that an environmentalist gets to dig in like this to a project, because a lot of times, it feels like we're in triage mode. And I've been really lucky that Western Watersheds Project has supported me digging into this work for the last 6 years, tracking this stuff down and keeping on it. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Greta. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I imagine for many of our viewers, this is really the first time they're getting an in-depth look at some of the behind the scenes of Mexican gray wolf recovery challenges. So for anyone who might have joined a little bit late, as a reminder, if you have questions for Greta, please type them into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. We already have a few building up, so I'll go ahead and start posing those to Greta. But again, feel free to type your questions in. We're already getting applause to Greta in the question and answer section as well. So yes, applause to Greta. Awesome crime scene investigation work. So really a lot of kudos to Greta and Cindy and Western Watersheds Project in the comments. So one of our first questions is actually it came up when you had your map on the screen, and they're wondering what mapping software you used to pin those points.
Yeah, that was ArcGIS. And if you go through the Intercept article that that I said, that'll be the easiest way to find it. You Google that, the map is live through the ArcGIS map is live through the Intercept site. So you should be able to look at that more closely yourself.
Amazing. Another question, and we have actually a few questions that are similar in topic, and they're relating to public involvement. How can the public get involved in some of this work? How would they obtain copies of predation reports? Do you have any recommendations? Things like that.
Yeah, so if you are in a state where if you're in a state where the species or the deaths are being investigated by Wildlife Services, which is a branch of the U.S. Department of Ag, you can use FOIA to request these, the Freedom of Information Act. You can submit a FOIA and ask for whatever you want. If you're in a state where the state is doing the investigations, you can submit a public records request and get that. If you're interested in any of these, I've got 6 years worth. I'll send you hundreds of bloody cow photos. But that would be my recommendation. I also, what this investigation turned into is not what it started with. We originally really just wanted to find out how can we improve ranching to reduce conflict. And then what we found out was the conflict was not even being accurately reported. So, think about the questions you're asking. If you've certainly can email me and I can help you figure out how to get the records that you want.
Amazing. This next question is a two-parter. So I'll ask the first part and then follow up with the second once you have time to answer the first, because it's a really great question. Is there a statute of limitations for the state to retrieve funds that were wrongfully dispersed to ranchers over unconfirmed kills due to the corruption of the agency?
Well, there is a lot to unpack in that question, and I will tell you that it is something I'm still chasing. So because of the Privacy Act and the redactions, I'm actually not able to figure out how many, I can figure out total dollars amounts being spent out of these various programs doing reimbursement, but I'm not able to figure out which depredation event they're being paid for because of this private financial information. So would be really difficult, although one would have to assume that when people are claiming literally hundreds of dead livestock, and that's more than were even reported in the program, that there must be some level of further inquiry that needs to be done, and we're certainly running down our options on that.
And then the second part, has the head of the agency retired yet, or are they up for a new appointment with the next election cycle? And then, or can you say when specifically? And then they're saying thank you to you in general for the presentation.
Oh, nice. So the head of the agency, the person who said that he knew the things were illegal, he actually resigned and filed a whistleblower complaint because he didn't get a promotion, and he thinks it's because he was going after them on these depredation investigations, and that's all documented in the Intercept article. So he's gone. There's a new head of wildlife services in New Mexico, but Arizona has the same problem. It's not just New Mexico. New Mexico has had worse examples, more egregious examples for a variety of reasons, and they definitely had the big spike in 2018 and 2019. But this runs from the people in the field to the people approving it to the people who are paying for it. It's multiple agencies involved. So I'm not quite sure who you mean, have they retired or up for appointment, but I hope that kind of answers it.
I think so. I think that was a great explanation, Greta. And you mentioned the spike in depredation reports. We actually had a question related to that. They've read the Intercept article before, and they're wondering what led to the spike in depredation reports. Was there a change in leadership?
Well, one thing that changed was that in the 2014 Farm Bill, the Livestock Indemnity Program put out specific funds for ranchers to be compensated for livestock losses due to reintroduced predators. So once there was this special pot of federal money, there's always been other places ranchers could get paid, but once there was this special pot of money, we started to see the numbers tick up. There was more incentive to have to start documenting or asserting these kinds of allegations because there was more money at stake. That's my suspicion. I also think that, we saw real variability. A lot of the information is redacted, but we have reason to believe that there were certain investigators whose rates of confirmation were like 99% of the time. When they were out on a call, it was a wolf kill. And those ranged from, 70 to 90%. So kind of depended on who was working, which year and which state.
Definitely. I think to maybe summarize that topic of questioning, I'll pose one more question related to that. In the future, would there be a path to hold these people and agencies liable for fraudulent reporting?
Well, I think that one thing I didn't get into here was that Senator Heinrich's office actually requested an Office of Inspector General investigation into this program. After we started making noise about it in the media, his office grew concerned and they asked for an investigation. That's, kind of the fox guarding the hen house. The OIG is within the same agency that it's investigating. And their conclusion about this whole thing was that the field agents weren't properly trained in how to photograph and document the sites. And so it wasn't, fraud as much as it was just a mistake. I don't know what to think. What I know is now they do a much better job with the I'm still foying and torturing myself by looking at dead cow pictures, but they do a much better job. It's a much more thorough. They change their form. They include a lot more photographs, and as a result, we're seeing a lot of the possible, probable, unknown, other a lot more evidence of maybe like a little better discernment about what's going on in the field and fewer confirmations overall. And I don't have those exact stats handy, but it's definitely declining the rates of being absolutely certain Mexican wolves were involved. So hopefully, to answer your question, hopefully in the future there won't be as many suspicious depredation reports. And because we've called attention to it, hopefully when there are multiple depredations being assigned to a certain wolf pack, that they'll get a harder look before Fish and Wildlife Service just says, okay, let's remove that wolf for all these dead cows. Let's take a harder look at the papers here and see if we really think the wolves were to blame.
Agreed. Some of our next questions, Greta, are more so acknowledging that with Mexican wolves in the landscape and cows on the landscape, that they're, even without reporting, there still might be some interactions. Are you seeing any increased efforts made by ranchers to ensure the safety of their livestock while grazing in Mexican wolf territory?
Yeah, so I mean, there are coexistence programs, and there is money for people to do coexistence and prevent conflict. One of the problems with livestock grazing out west and in these landscapes is, the livestock are untended. They turn them out, they calve all year long. There's, calves being born in January when there's no other very few other wildlife species, wildlife babies, easy prey on the landscape. So there's some reforms that are really needed in grazing management, and we've been pushing the Forest Service to require those reforms, not just leave it at the discretion of the ranchers, but because it's more work for the ranchers, right? But it's better for the endangered species that's recovering in the same landscape.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Going off of that, there's a question. I believe many folks on the call are familiar with Voyager's Wolf Project up in Minnesota. But there's a question, are there possibilities of doing fencing and guard dogs cooperatively with ranch owners, similar to how Voyager's project has a partnership with a ranch/farm that is in a wolf pack territory in Minnesota?
Well, there are people using guard dogs and range riders and all kinds of things on ranches down here. That's not work that we do, but what that Western Watersheds does, but there are other conservation organizations that are doing that kind of coexistence work.
And regarding the fencing component and public lands grazing, is fencing an option for livestock owners who are leasing public lands? Some of our questions then get more into some of the public lands grazing aspect as a whole. So thought that could be a good segue in. Essentially, can a rancher who is leasing public grazing lands, are they allowed to put up fences?
Well, there are a lot of fences out there already, rest assured. And one of the issues in the arid West is the productivity of the land is pretty low. And so if you have a big herd of cows, they have to be spread all over a huge portion of the landscape, just because there's not enough for them to eat unless they have access to a lot of places. But they're, having having your calves be born within a electrified fence pasture, or having them be closer up to the house. Like, those are all great ideas. It's just, the problem is, because wolves were wiped off of the landscape, even though they totally belong here and they're native species. And because for the last 100 years, ranchers have not had to worry about wolf predation on their livestock. To get ranchers interested in proactive management instead of just like eradicate the wolves again or kill the wolves is a challenge. It's a change for them. And so it's one of the things that, we like to emphasize the rights of native species to occupy the only landscapes they can exist on, and say, public lands, livestock grazing, if you can't coexist and you can't make a go of it with the full suite of carnivores, then maybe that's not the right place for your business anymore.
Agreed. I think also, I know I plugged it earlier in the chat, but shameless promo for Western Watersheds and their new merch. No cows, no sheep, no problem. So some of our other questions, kind of going off what you were just saying, why does the cow have priority over a wolf if it is on public lands? And I think that question is so applicable, not just to the Mexican wolf recovery area, but to many other states in the West as well. Can you shed any light on that, Greta?
Well, look, I mean, the cowboys, the ranchers, the public land, the livestock industry, it was part of the whole colonization project of the Western United States. They not just wiped out native predators, but they were part of the genocide that wiped out native people. They've had a lot of political power in our country for the last 150 years. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of political influence, and they had it their way once before we knew better. Predators, mountain lions, grizzly bears, jaguars, wolves were exterminated. And what we learned is that that's actually not good for anybody. It may be good for the rancher's bottom line, but it's not good for the ecosystem health. And there's many more of us who depend on the ecosystem being healthy. So the power dynamic around, that a cow is more important than a wolf is something that has to shift. Now, don't get me wrong, those cows are important to those ranchers, right? Like, this is their business, and it's a problem for them that there's a new threat to their business model. The problem is we've got nowhere else to recover endangered species, and there's only 22,000 public lands livestock grazers. Only 2% of all of the beef in the US market comes off of Western public lands. That could go away tomorrow and people wouldn't even notice. I mean, individuals would notice. I'm not saying it wouldn't have an impact, but I'm saying by and large, it's not really that important, weighed against the importance of it for wildlife and for, healthy watersheds and clean air, climate, carbon sequestration, all of that. People are starting to wake up to the balance of inequities there.
Definitely. Hopefully we'll see some change. Speaking of change, we have someone wondering if their representatives are not in the West, or they're not on lands that perhaps Western Watersheds Project is actively working on. How can they best make a difference with their voices?
Well, one thing to do is to just really keep advocating for the Endangered Species Act whenever you have a chance, because these public lands belong to all of us. Native and recovering wildlife belong to all of us. Endangered species is of concern to all of us. And there's always big pushes to weaken the Endangered Species Act. I think that advocating for maintaining and strengthening the Endangered Species Act is important. Keeping an eye out for opportunities to ensure that the Farm Bill doesn't continue to hand out money for depredations that don't have, a lot of evidence behind them is something that's coming up. The Farm Bill was supposed to be done last year. Our Congress is such a mess that everything is, kind of hard to get through. But I would say, continuing to advocate for endangered species and their right to recover on the landscape is something everybody can do from anywhere.
Agreed. And then I'm being mindful of the time, but we do have a few more questions. So Greta, if you don't mind, I might just try to squeeze in some of these. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat saying that you need to do more of these to share your work and the everything you've uncovered. We're getting some questions about the funding and reimbursement. And some folks are wondering, do ranchers get reimbursed for livestock depredation from other predators besides wolves? And do other predators get as much of the blame for deaths as wolves have?
So no, reimbursement and compensation programs, at least the major one, the livestock indemnity program, is just for federally reintroduced predators. So that's things like Mexican wolf or gray wolf and other places. They do not get compensated for the loss of livestock due to other species. But remember, they can kill the other species. So the regulations in Arizona, New Mexico, you can kill coyotes pretty much, with abandon, very few rules around that. You can get permits to kill, permits and licenses to kill depredating bears or mountain lions. So, they take they take action in a different way. Now, they do also get Mexican wolves removed after a certain number of depredations, but it's a much harder process because it's a federally protected species. But yeah, somebody remarked in the comments, I saw this, it's like, well, wait, they're getting paid for the dead cows and getting the wolves removed? And it's like, yes, they are. And we feel like, you can't have it both. It's your cake and eating it too, right? So.
Yeah, it's a tough situation, especially knowing that there's so much work being done to improve it, and it seems to be a very slow progress. We have a question regarding Arizona and New Mexico. Are there areas that don't allow grazing? And is there any effort to create more areas that would be only for wildlife and wolves?
There are very few areas that are not grazed on public lands. Fortunately, within the Mexican wolf recovery area, there's a big patch of the Gila wilderness that's free of livestock, and that's not very many wolves have moved into that area, but they would not have conflict there. They're a great place for wolves could be the Grand Canyon National Park. That's livestock free. It would be great habitat. Arizona Game and Fish Department and other state agencies have been opposed to having wolves go north of Interstate 40, and that's another presentation for another day. But that's another place where there'd be free of conflict. Our goal, though, is to reduce the conflict for wolves everywhere. And it isn't just for wolves. It's like there's, New Mexico meadow jumping mouse. There's lots of other species that are affected by public lands livestock grazing. And so minimizing the conflict just for wolves is important while we recover this species. But in the long run, something like a quarter of all of the species on the endangered species list are endangered by livestock grazing. So to get those species off the list, we've got to do a lot more.
And you just, going off of what you just mentioned, Greta, about species being threatened by livestock grazing, one of the earlier questions was asking what groups benefit economically from more, benefiting ranchers, and because in a sense, if you're not really addressing the problem, because as we know, killing wolves doesn't actually solve any livestock conflict, and as we've seen in other states, it can increase conflict. But what groups are benefiting from the wolves being killed? Is there an increase in tolerance if a wolf is being killed, even though ranchers are also getting compensated? Can you shed any light on that?
Well, no, there's not increase in tolerance. The very same ranchers getting paid are advocating for wolf removals on the regular, so it's not building tolerance. Groups that are benefiting, I mean, the ranchers are benefiting because it's basically a subsidy. They're already being subsidized by only paying $1.35 a month per cow to graze on our public lands. And then, other that is another presentation, all of the subsidies. But it's also a mindset about who gets to control the land, whether the land is, its highest and best use is being put into economic service, direct economic service for humans. There's a lot of, there's ideologies about our relationship with the earth, and those folks benefit from still having the kind of dominion over all things and being able to see wolves removed. I don't know if that answers the question, but
It does it does to me, and I hope to the individual who posed the question as well. So being, again, trying to squeeze in maybe perhaps one last broad question, because we've had a few questions about this. With Mexican wolves and I-40, and they do acknowledge that this is maybe a question, as you've been saying, for another webinar, but is there any talk of creating wildlife corridors to perhaps decrease interactions with ranchers, but still allow Mexican wolves to travel to other portions of their ancestral range? Or is that very challenging in the West with the way we know that the lands are being used?
Yeah, I mean, ranching is everywhere. There's very few places where there's, a free and clear corridor for a wolf to run. But what is interesting is to see, as the wolf population has expanded, is to start to see part of what's really important for wolves is their dispersers. And this is how they keep from being inbred, is they go seek mates in packs far afield. And now that there's a sufficient, not sufficient, don't get me wrong, there are not enough wolves on the ground and there's lots of issues, but as the population in the areas that I showed you has grown, there's more and more dispersers kind of looking for more of the landscape for their own packs to establish. And right now they're constrained by these arbitrary political boundaries, but I think the more wolves that venture beyond, the harder it's going to be for agencies to, hold the line on these geographic territories. It's, wolves are wild animals. They're not going to stay within the neat box that has been drawn for them. And at some point, humans are going to have to kind of accept that and make changes.
I couldn't agree more, Greta, and I imagine the same is for everyone who's on the call. Well, so we do, we have so many questions, and I apologize to folks who perhaps didn't have a question answered, Greta did have her email very generously up on the screen. So if anyone is interested in learning more, reaching out, feel free to reach out to Greta. We will be posting a recording of this on our YouTube channel as well. So if you missed something or, want to share it with a friend, you can certainly reference that. I've also posted the Intercept article in the chat as well. And Western Watersheds website is in the chat too. So a lot of great resources to continue to learn a bit more about the intricacies of Mexican wolf recovery and the challenges they face from sharing a landscape with livestock and how that can impact their recovery and their expansion. But Greta, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think for many, this is really one of the first times that, we're looking at a challenge to wolves that is not just, it's very human-centric, but it's not just hunting. There's, a whole other economic side to human impacts on Mexican wolves. And I think many people will be inspired to do a bit more research and think about how we as humans can make the West a bit safer for wolves. But also a great way to do that, folks, is to support Western Watersheds as well. So on their website, you'll see options to donate, ways to support their work. And hopefully we'll continue to see more, hopefully not great. I was going to say great work coming out, but then I was like, I don't want to see great work coming out in the sense that I don't want there to be more fraudulent activities. But I think the work you're doing, Greta, is really paving the way for a better future for wolves. And we are so lucky to have had the opportunity to chat with you and learn more about it. And folks in the chat are really just agreeing.
I
They feel
am so much. It's so nice. Thank you.
So we might have to get you back in a few months, Greta, if there's if there's any more developments. I think this is really tugged at the heartstrings and really a very new topic of discussion for us. So thank you again, Greta. Is there anything you'd like to say as we close out?
Oh, I'm just glad that so many people found it of interest and, compelling, because I think, a lot of these details are like a little arcane. And sometimes when I'm, sitting at my desk scrolling through dead cow pictures, you just never really know. You never know what's going to happen, but it turns out it's like maybe actually saving wolves, and that's pretty cool. So thank you all for your support and your support in the comments. That means a lot to me. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, Greta. And one of my favorite comments just came in, one of the best webinars about wolves. Thank you. And I can agree. So thank you again, Greta. Thank you everyone for joining. As a reminder, Greta joined us from the Western Watersheds Project and really great resources on their website. But thank you all so much for throwing an hour of your time to Mexican wolves, and happy Lobo Week all. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.